There are things I've witnessed that no one back home would believe, not even my buddies who've served. Every Marine has stories of patrols gone sideways, weird locals, or nights on watch when you'd swear you heard something that wasn't there. But those stories, as wild as they are, don't touch what I've seen. The kind of things that won't fit in any report. You learn quick in the field what can be explained and what can't, but nothing ever prepares you for the moment you stop asking, what is it? And just focus on surviving it. The first time it happened, I was stationed in Afghanistan. We were sent to secure a remote village near the mountains, one of those places you won't find on any map. It was me, 3 others from my squad, and a local interpreter named Kareem. The village had gone silent, and we were tasked with figuring out why. Radio contact was sketchy at best, so we were essentially on our own. The intel was vague. Reports of missing livestock, strange lights in the hills, and rumors of something cursed driving people away. The hike in was uneventful, but as we got closer, the terrain started feeling wrong. The air didn't carry the smells of life I'd grown used to in these parts. No goats, no cooking fires, nothing. Just dry earth and stale wind. Kareem was jittery, muttering prayers under his breath. I thought it was the usual nerves, but I caught him glancing at the mountains often, like he was expecting something to be watching us. When we reached the village, it was empty. Not abandoned, empty. Pots sat on stoves, half-cooked meals inside. Clothes hung from lines, stiff with dust. It was like everyone had just vanished. We spread out, looking for any signs of a struggle, but there wasn't a single mark of violence. No blood, no bodies, not even a damn footprint in the dirt. That's when the first rule came. Don't look past the ridgeline after dark. Kareem was the one who told us, his voice low, like he didn't want the mountains to hear. If you see something moving out there at night, anything, pretend you don't. It's not for you to know, he'd said, not elaborating. And honestly, I thought it was just more local superstition, but something in his tone stuck with me. Like he'd already decided we wouldn't make it out. We set up in what looked like the village elder's house, sturdier than the others, with thick stone walls and a solid door. I volunteered for first watch. Sitting outside under the open sky, I scanned the ridgeline through my scope. The moonlight made the barren peaks seem almost alive, with jagged rocks casting long shapes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. First couple hours were quiet, and then I saw movement. A flicker at the edge of my vision. Something darted between the rocks, quick and low to the ground. I trained my rifle on the spot, waiting, but it didn't show itself again. I told myself it was a jackal or some other animal, but the way it moved, fast, almost like it was crawling, set my teeth on edge. I didn't mention it when I handed off to Hernandez for the next watch. He was one of those guys who could joke through anything, and I didn't want to give him ammo to bust my chops. But when I woke up to the sound of the door slamming, Hernandez wasn't laughing. He'd locked himself inside and refused to open up until morning. I don't know what the hell I saw, right? He muttered when we pressed him. He wouldn't look at us, just kept glancing at the door like he expected something to break through. That's when Kareem spoke up again. The ridgeline, he'd said. Did you look? Hernandez nodded, his face pale. Kareem cursed under his breath and said we needed to leave because they know we're here now. We didn't leave. Orders were orders, and we weren't going to bail on a mission because of some creepy local legends. We spent the day scouring the village for anything that might explain what happened to the people. No luck. By sundown, the tension was thick enough to choke on. That night, I took last watch. Around 0300, I heard the scraping. It started faint, like wind dragging loose branches across the ground. But it got louder, closer. I strained my eyes, trying to spot the source, but the darkness beyond the village seemed to swallow the light, and then it stopped. The silence was worse. Every instinct screamed at me to wake the others, but something froze me in place. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural clicking, not like any animal I'd ever heard. It came from the far edge of the village, near one of the crumbling huts. Slowly, I swung my rifle in that direction, finger on the trigger. The thing that crawled out of the hut, it was wrong. It moved like a spider. Its head was oversized, with hollow eyes that reflected the faint green glow of my scope. I didn't fire. I couldn't. It was like my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. The thing cocked its head at me, its jaw unhinging, and then it scuttled back into the hut, faster than anything that size should move. By the time I woke the others, Kareem didn't seem surprised. "You didn't shoot," he'd said. It wasn't a question. The hell was I supposed to shoot at? I snapped back. He didn't answer, just muttering something about the second rule. If it doesn't act human, don't treat it like one. After that, we stopped sleeping in shifts. If something was out there, we figured it was better to face it together. That night, we barricaded ourselves in the elder's house and sat with our backs to the walls, weapons ready. Around midnight, the whisper started. Faint at first, like someone speaking just out of earshot. None of us said a word, but I could see the others straining to listen. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. We froze. Another knock, slower this time. Who's there?" Hernandez called out, his voice shaky. No answer. Just a third knock, softer, almost hesitant. Kareem stood and grabbed his rifle, motioning for us to stay back. He opened the door a crack and peered out, then slammed it shut, his face white as a sheet. "It's not real," he said. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't open the door again." We didn't ask what he saw. By morning, we were ready to get out. Radio or no radio, we decided to hike back to base and report what we'd found, or hadn't found. But when we stepped outside, the village wasn't the same. The houses were still there, but the layout was different. Paths that should have led to the main road twisted into narrow alleys that looped back on themselves. Landmarks we'd marked on the map were gone. It was like the village had shifted overnight, rearranging itself into a maze. And that's when Kareem told us the third rule. Once you enter a place like this, it doesn't let you leave the same way. I wanted to punch him for not telling us sooner, but the fear in his eyes kept me from saying anything. He didn't know how to get us out any more than we did. By now, we were running low on supplies. Water was rationed, and the only food we had left was a couple of MREs. We spent the day trying to find the road out, but no matter which direction we walked, we always ended up back at the elder's house. That night, we heard the laughter. It started as a single voice, high-pitched and childlike, echoing from somewhere in the distance. Then more joined in, a chorus of giggles that didn't sound human. Kareem made us sit in a circle, our backs to each other, He said we couldn't let them see our faces. That was the fourth rule. Never make eye contact. I don't know how long we sat there, listening to the laughter grow louder and closer. At some point, I thought I felt something brush against my leg, but I didn't dare look. When the laughter finally stopped, it was like a weight lifted off my chest. Hernandez wasn't so lucky. We found him slumped against the wall, his eyes wide open and unblinking. He didn't respond when we shook him, and his breathing was shallow. Kareem checked him over, said he was alive, but his pupils were blown, like he'd seen something too much for his mind to handle. By the fifth day, Kareem was gone. I woke up to find his rifle and pack still in the corner, but no sign of him. The village was quieter than usual, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint sound of the wind. I tried carrying Hernandez, but he was dead weight. His body was warm, but he wouldn't eat, drink, or speak. He just stared at nothing, his lips moving silently, like he was repeating something only he could hear. That night, I saw the lights. They appeared one by one, floating above the ridgeline like lanterns. They started moving toward the village, weaving through the air in slow, deliberate patterns. As they got closer, I could make out shapes within the lights, twisted figures. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. The sound of my own voice screaming. The sensation of being dragged. And those lights, always just out of reach, pulling me deeper into the maze. I woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, dehydrated and delirious. They told me a search team found me wandering near the base, alone. No sign of Hernandez or Kareem. No sign of the village. I didn't tell them what happened. What would be the point? Even now, I can't say for sure what was real and what wasn't. But I know this much. I will never go near those mountains again. Some places aren't meant to be understood, and some rules are better left unbroken. Afghanistan wasn't the last time I saw something I couldn't explain. As much as I wanted to believe it was just a freak event, something that could be chalked up to sleep deprivation or paranoia, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened in that village had opened a door. It's like once you see one crack in reality, you start noticing more. Maybe it's the places we're sent, far from civilization, where the rules are thinner. Or maybe it's us. The things we carry. The things we've done. What I do know is that those mountains weren't the end of it. The second time was in the Philippines. Jungle deployment, joint operation with local forces. Our objective was to track down a militant group operating out of the southern islands, deep in the rainforest. It should have been a straightforward mission, but when we reached the rendezvous point, the locals were spooked. The lieutenant brushed it off as nerves, but the way they kept glancing at the treetops and muttering under their breath set me on edge. One of their leaders, a grizzled man with a face like old leather, pulled me aside while the officers talked. He didn't speak much English, but he managed to get the message across. "Bad place," he said, gesturing to the jungle ahead. "No go." When I asked why, he just shook his head and tapped his temple. "Bad spirits." We went anyway. The jungle was dense, the kind of place that swallows sound. Even with all of us moving together, the only noise was the crunch of boots on dead leaves and the occasional squawk of some unseen bird. After a while, even those sounds faded, replaced by an unnatural quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It started small, branches moving when there was no wind, shapes flickering at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was just the jungle playing tricks, but then we found the clearing. The trees around it, they were massive, their trunks twisting unnaturally, like they were frozen mid-writhing. Their bark was blackened, not burned, but different, like it'd grown that way. In the center of the clearing was a stone statue, half buried in vines. It looked ancient, older than anything I'd ever seen, with carvings that made my stomach churn just looking at them. The lieutenant ordered us to secure the area, but the locals refused to step into the clearing. They stayed at the edge, clutching their rifles and muttering prayers. I didn't blame them. The air inside was strange, like the world was holding its breath. And that's when we saw the first one. It was Johnson who spotted it. A face staring at us from one of the twisted trees. It blinked. So help me God, it blinked. Its eyes were sunken and milky, its mouth frozen in a grin. Johnson aimed his rifle, but before he could fire, it moved. Not like a person. It didn't climb down or jump. It just shifted, like it was part of the tree, and then it wasn't. More faces appeared, dozens of them, emerging from the trunks and branches. Some were human, others distorted into shapes that made my stomach turn. They didn't move toward us, they just watched, their grins growing wider. The lieutenant ordered us to fall back, but when we turned, the clearing wasn't there anymore. The trees had shifted, closing in like a wall. We didn't make camp that night. We kept moving, trying to find a way out. Every path we took led us back to the clearing. Around midnight, the locals finally spoke up. They told us to stop looking for a way out and just wait. They choose, one of them had said. If they let us leave, we leave. If not, he'd trailed off, shaking his head. We waited. The faces watched us from the trees, their eyes unblinking. Johnson couldn't take it anymore. He opened fire, unloading his entire magazine into one of the trunks. The face didn't flinch, and that's when the screaming started. It wasn't human. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a high-pitched wail that made my teeth hurt. The trees moved, their branches writhing like snakes, and the ground beneath us buckled. The locals dropped to their knees, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The rest of us just stood there, frozen, our weapons useless in our hands. And then, it just stopped. The faces vanished, the trees stilled, and the clearing was gone. When we finally stumbled out of the jungle, the locals refused to speak about what had happened. The lieutenant filed the mission as a success, but none of us talked about what we'd seen. The third time was off the coast of Somalia. Anti-piracy patrol, nothing special. We were stationed on a small frigate, spending most of our time staring at empty water. One night, I was on deck watch with a guy named Larson. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but there was something off about the horizon. It was darker than it should have been. We were scanning the water when we saw it. At first, I thought it was a whale breaching, but it was too big, much bigger than any whale I'd ever seen. The shape rose out of the water, massive and black, its surface glistening like oil. It stayed there for a moment, towering over the waves, and then it began to move towards us. Larson panicked, calling out to the bridge, but the comms were dead. The thing kept coming. By the time it reached the ship, the entire crew was on deck, weapons drawn. It didn't attack. It just loomed there. The air grew thick, and it got cold, frost forming on the rails and windows. The captain ordered us to fire, but our weapons didn't do anything. The rounds disappeared into its mass, swallowed like pebbles in a pond. The thing stayed there for hours. Some of the crew started acting strange, walking toward the edge of the deck like they were in a trance. We had to physically restrain them to keep them from jumping overboard. When dawn finally broke, the thing was gone. Nobody saw it leave, and the comms came back online as if nothing had happened. The official report listed it as an unidentified marine anomaly, but none of us believed that. Whatever it was not natural. After that, I started noticing patterns. The places we went, the missions we were sent on, they weren't random. There was something about them, something the higher-ups weren't telling us. I don't know if it's the military itself or just the things we're exposed to, but I've come to realize there are rules to all of this. Rules you have to figure out on your own, because nobody's gonna spell them out for you. Here's what I've learned so far. If something doesn't feel right, probably isn't. Trust your instincts. Don't break the rules of the place you're in. Every location has its own rules, and they're not always obvious. If you can't fight it, don't try. Some things are beyond bullets and bravery. Never go alone. And the most important rule of all, once you've seen them, they've seen you. I used to think I'd be able to leave all this behind when I got out. That once I was back home, the things I'd seen would stay in the places I'd left them. I was wrong. But that's a story for another day. It was my second deployment in Eastern Europe when we encountered something I wish I could unsee. Officially, we were training with Allied forces in Romania, running exercises in the Carpathian region, where dense forests stretched as far as the eye could see. Unofficially, we were investigating reports of missing personnel from a nearby NATO base. A small recon team of 6, tasked with finding out why soldiers were disappearing without a trace. What we found was not in any field manual. The trail led us to a tiny, decrepit village nestled in the foothills. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold secrets. The houses were ancient, made of cracked stone and rotting wood, their windows dark and lifeless. The few villagers we saw hurried inside at the sight of us, muttering to each other in hushed tones. We split into pairs to cover more ground. I was with Davis, a good kid from Texas who had a knack for making everyone laugh when the tension got too high. That night, though, there wasn't much to laugh about. As we moved through the village, we noticed strange symbols carved into the doors and fences, circles with jagged lines radiating outward, like crude suns. They were everywhere, as if the whole town had tried to ward off something. "You ever seen anything like this before, Sarge?" Davis asked, running his hand over one of the carvings. "No," I said, scanning the tree line, "and I don't want to stick around to find out what it's for." And then we heard the scream. It came from one of the houses near the edge of the village. We rushed over, weapons raised, and found the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of blood. A soldier from the NATO base was lying on the floor, his throat torn open, blood pooling beneath him. Standing over the body was something. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, lean, dressed in ragged black clothing. But then it turned to face us, and I saw its eyes. They were blood red, glowing faintly in the dim light. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its mouth was smeared with blood, sharp teeth glinting as it snarled. "My God," Davis muttered, stepping back. The thing moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment it was standing over the body. The next it was on Davis, pinning him to the ground. He screamed as its teeth sank into his neck. I didn't think. I just fired. The rounds hit it square in the back, but they might as well have been BBs for all the good they did. The thing hissed and turned its attention to me, its mouth dripping with Davis's blood. It lunged, and I barely got out of the way. "Davis, move," I said, but he didn't respond. He was on the ground, clutching his neck, his eyes wide with terror. The creature lunged again, but this time I was ready. I grabbed a piece of broken furniture, a chair leg with a sharp splintered edge, and I drove it into its chest as hard as I could. It let out an unearthly shriek, thrashing wildly, before collapsing in a heap. For a moment I thought it was over, and then its body dissolved into ash, scattering across the floor like dry leaves. Davis was still alive, but barely. I took off a piece of my uniform to press against the wound on his neck. The bleeding stopped quicker than it should have, and the skin around the bite had turned a sickly gray. "We need to get him back to the others," I said, lifting him onto my shoulder. He didn't resist, his body limp and cold. When we regrouped, I didn't tell the others exactly what had happened. I just said Davis had been attacked by an animal. The look in his eyes, though, cloudy and distant, told me it was something far worse. We hunkered down in an abandoned barn for the night, taking turns on watch. Davis was quiet, lying in the corner with his back to the wall. He refused to eat, his breathing shallow and uneven. At some point during my shift, I heard him muttering to himself. I moved closer, trying to make out the words. "Thirsty," he said. "I'm so thirsty." By morning, Davis wasn't Davis anymore. His skin had turned almost white, and his eyes had taken on the same blood-red hue as the creature from the night before. He avoided the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the barn's walls, his movements jerky and unnatural. When we tried to talk to him, he just stared at us, his lips curling into a faint smile. "We have to do something," Carter, one of the other Marines, said. "He's not right. You saw what attacked him, didn't you? It wasn't human, was it? And now he's turning into one of them." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew he was right. That night, Davis attacked. We were preparing to move out when he lunged at Carter, knocking him to the ground. His strength was unbelievable, tossing a fully armed Marine like a rag doll. I barely had time to react before he was on top of me, his teeth snapping inches from my face. "Davis, stop," I said, but there was no recognition in his eyes, just hunger. The others pulled him off me, pinning him to the ground. He thrashed and snarled like a wild animal, his strength almost too much for all of us. "We can't keep him like this," Carter said. I knew what had to be done, but saying it out loud felt like betrayal. "We wait until sunrise," I said. We tied Davis to a post in the barn, using everything we had. Ropes, belts, even a chain we found hanging from the rafters. He thrashed and growled through the night, his voice no longer sounding human. When dawn came, we dragged him outside. As the first rays of sunlight touched his skin, he screamed, smoke rising from his body like steam. "I'm so sorry," I told him. The sunlight consumed him, his body igniting in a burst of flames. Within moments, there was nothing left but ash. The others didn't say anything as we packed up and left the village. What could they say? We never reported what happened. The official story was that Davis was killed in action, his body unrecoverable. The rest of us were debriefed and sent back to base, but the looks we exchanged said everything. We knew what we'd seen. Since then, I've learned to pay attention to the stories people don't want to tell, the superstitions, the warnings that sound like nonsense until they're not. There's a reason every culture has stories about monsters. Sometimes, the stories are the only thing standing between us and them. After Romania, I swore I'd never brush off local warnings again, but promises like that have a way of fading when duty calls. It was a year later, and I was stationed on a remote base in the Balkans, deep in the forested mountains. The mission was supposed to be straightforward, a training exercise with Allied forces just like the last one. But when the locals warned us about going too far in the woods, I listened. At least I thought I did. We were conducting a recon op one night. Just me, Sergeant Lopez, and a couple of younger Marines. The area we were scouting was supposed to be clear, but the higher-ups wanted eyes on us just in case. The terrain was rough, with steep slopes and thick underbrush that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It didn't take long for things to go sideways. About an hour into the patrol, we came across a dead deer. At first glance, it wasn't unusual. Wild animals take each other out all the time. But as we got closer, the details didn't add up. The deer's body was torn apart, its ribs cracked open like a can of sardines. Whatever had killed it wasn't just feeding. It was angry. The claw marks were too deep. The bites too violent. This wasn't the work of wolves or bears. Lopez crouched next to the carcass, frowning. What do you think did this? I didn't answer. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the feeling that we were being watched. Let's keep moving, I said. We pressed on, but the forest was different now. The usual sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had gone silent, replaced by a heavy stillness, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every step sound too loud. And that's when we heard the howl. It started as a low growl, barely audible over the crunch of our boots. We froze, scanning the darkness with our rifles raised. The growl turned into a snarl, then a deep, guttural howl that seemed to echo everywhere. The hell was that? One of the younger Marines, Bishop, said. Not a wolf, Lopez replied, his grip tightening on his rifle. The howl came again, closer this time. Whatever it was circling us, its movements too fast to track. Eyes on, I barked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Watch your sectors. The underbrush rustled, and something massive charged out of the darkness. It hit Bishop first, knocking into the ground before we could react. The thing that attacked him, it was huge, easily over 7 feet tall, with shaggy, matted fur and a snout full of teeth. Its eyes burned yellow, glowing faintly in the moonlight. It wasn't just a big wolf. It was something worse. Bishop screamed as the beast's claws raked across his chest, blood spraying on the forest floor. I opened fire. The beast recoiled as the rounds hit it, but it didn't fall. Lopez and I kept firing, but the bullets barely seemed to slow it down. It lunged at me, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I ducked and scrambled backward, my heart pounding, as I realized we were out of our depth. The beast wasn't letting us fall back. It charged again, this time knocking Lopez to the ground. Desperate, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a jagged piece of scrap metal lying half buried in the dirt. Wasn't much, but it was something. I swung it at the beast's side, and to my surprise, it howled in pain. The smell of burning fur filled the air, and the creature stumbled back, snarling. "Silver," Lopez said, clutching his side as he crawled away. "It hates silver." I didn't have time to question how he knew that. The beast lunged again, and I drove the metal into its chest with all my strength. The effect was immediate. The beast let out an ear-splitting roar, its body convulsing, as smoke poured from the wound. It staggered, claws swiping wildly, before collapsing. I didn't stop. I drove the silver deeper, twisting it until the beast stopped moving. When it was over, the forest was silent again. I sat there panting, staring at the massive, lifeless body in front of me. The others were in rough shape. Bishop was barely conscious, his chest a mess of claw marks, and Lopez was bleeding from a deep gash. "Is it dead?" Lopez asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the shard of silver and plunged it into the beast's neck, just to be sure. By the time we made it back to base, Bishop was in bad condition. He didn't make it through the night. The medic said it was the blood loss, but I knew better. The look in his eyes as he lay there, fading, there was something inhuman about it. The official report listed the attack as a bear encounter. Nobody questioned it, and no one wanted to hear otherwise. But Lopez and I knew the truth. After that night, I started carrying a silver knife. It might not fit regulation, but I wasn't about to be caught unprepared again. I don't know where the beast came from, or if there are more like it, but I do know this. Some predators aren't just animals. There's something worse. After everything I'd seen overseas, I thought I'd left the worst of it behind when I got back to the States. I'd done my time, survived more than my share of combat, and whatever the hell you'd call the rest. Coming home should have felt like a relief, but the shadows of what I'd seen stayed with me. You don't shake memories like that. But this was different. It wasn't just bad dreams or sleepless nights. Something followed me home. Something I couldn't fight with a rifle or a knife, no matter how many rounds I chambered or how sharp I kept my blade. It started small. The first few nights, I chalked it up to adjusting. It's normal to feel on edge after deployment, to get that itch in the back of your skull like someone's watching you. But this felt specific. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain there was someone in my room. My eyes would dart to the shadows, beneath the bed, in the corners, but nothing was ever there. At least nothing I could see. And then I started hearing laughter. Faint at first. I'd get out of bed, walk through the house with my pistol drawn, but it would stop. There'd be no sound, just that sinking feeling that I wasn't alone. The dreams started after that. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just a nightmare. I was standing in a dimly lit room, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper. There was a smell, metallic and sharp, like blood left out in the sun. I saw him. He was crouched in the corner, his skin a deep mottled red, as if it had been flayed raw. His face was long, angular. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me and grinned. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding, but the room was silent. Just a dream, I told myself. Except I could still smell it, that metallic tang in the air. The second time was worse. It happened a few nights later. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when I felt it. A weight pressing down on my chest, like someone had sat on me. My arms and legs wouldn't move, no matter how much I tried. And then I saw him again. He was standing at the foot of my bed this time, his head tilted at a strange angle. His grin was even wider now, showing rows of jagged teeth. He didn't move, but the room grew colder. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I could only watch as he leaned closer. I could feel his breath on my face. And then he was gone. By the third time, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. This thing was real, and it wanted me to know it. I didn't know where to turn. Calling the VA to say I was being haunted didn't seem like an option. My family wouldn't understand. I didn't want to scare him. In the end, I went old school. I called a priest. Now, Father O'Connell was the real deal. Old but still sharp, with a voice that carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. He didn't flinch when I told him about the thing in my house. Didn't laugh or write it off as PTSD. He just nodded and said, "I'll come by tomorrow." When Father O'Connell arrived, he walked through each room, muttering prayers under his breath and sprinkling holy water on the walls. It wasn't until we got to the bedroom that things changed. As soon as he stepped inside, his face went pale. "It's here," he said, clutching the crucifix around his neck. I'd expected him to say something reassuring, to tell me, I don't know, that it was all going to be fine. Instead, he looked at me and said, "You need to pray." We started the exorcism just before sunset. Father O'Connell lit candles and set up a small altar in the living room. He handed me a rosary and told me to repeat his words no matter what happened. At first, it felt awkward, like we were playing at something bigger than we had a right to. But as he started reciting the prayers, the room grew colder. The candles flickered, the flames shrinking as if the air itself had been sucked out. And then it was there. The red-faced man stepped out of the shadows, his grin wider than ever. He didn't lunge or snarl, he just stood there watching, as if daring us to continue. Father O'Connell's voice didn't waver. He held up the crucifix and commanded the thing to leave. The demon didn't like that. The room erupted into chaos. The candles blew out, plunging the room into darkness. Furniture toppled, and the air filled with the sound of something scraping against the walls. And then it was on me. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Its hands wrapping around my throat, its breath hot and foul against my face. I clawed at the air, gasping, but it was like fighting smoke. "Pray, son," Father O'Connell said, his voice cutting through the darkness. I forced the words out, choking on each syllable. And with every prayer, the grip on my throat loosened, the air around me growing hotter. Father O'Connell pressed the crucifix against the floor, shouting Latin phrases I didn't understand. The demon let out a guttural scream, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere. And then it was gone. When the lights came back on, the room was a mess. The walls were scorched, the furniture overturned. But things felt better. Father O'Connell looked exhausted. "It's done," he said. I wanted to believe him, to think it was over. But a part of me knew better. I haven't seen the red-faced man since that night, but I think I still feel him sometimes. In the quiet moments, when the house is too still, when I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'm not alone. The priest told me something before he left, something I haven't been able to forget. "Evil doesn't just appear, son," he'd said. "It's drawn to something. Pain, guilt, anger. Whatever you've seen, whatever you've done, it leaves a mark. And sometimes, that's enough to invite it in." I don't know what I brought back with me from those deployments. Maybe it's just the memories, the weight of the things I've seen. Or maybe it's something worse. What I do know is this: coming home doesn't mean you're safe. Not from them. Some doors, once opened, never really close. After the exorcism, I tried to rebuild a life that felt normal. I started spending time at the VA, helping other veterans who were struggling to adjust after deployment. It felt good to give back, to share stories, and let them know they weren't alone. But I never talked about the things I'd seen, the things I still saw. That was a weight I carried privately. Father O'Connell became something of a reluctant confidant. Every few months we'd grab coffee, and he'd ask me how things were. I could tell he was still shaken by what happened that night, but he never refused when I called him. "The work isn't over," he told me once, and I knew he wasn't just talking about me. Even now, I keep an eye out for the signs, whispers where there shouldn't be any, faces in the corners of my vision, unnatural stillness in the air. Most of the time it's nothing, but every so often I feel it, the faint hum of something that doesn't belong. I've come to accept that the world isn't what we think it is. There are cracks in the foundation, places where the rules don't hold. And while I may never understand the things I've seen, I know enough to keep watch. Because once you've faced what's out there, you realize it's always watching you too. Hey, thank you for listening. We have some really great stories coming up on this channel the next few weeks. And if you like true stories, head over to the second channel, Lighthouse, and check it out. Have a good night.